When Ben agreed to join two longtime rivals for a night of exploring an abandoned pre-Civil War era plantation, he expected to find just that. A creepy old home falling apart, maybe even catch a glimpse of the rumored spirits that inhabited the old dark mansion. But what he would discover inside was far more terrifying than any old ghost story. Welcome to Ben's True Reality of Twisted Horror. Ben was hesitant to sneak inside the old Chatterwick mansion when some former classmates had invited him along. The old plantation was said to be one of the most haunted places in all of central Kentucky. He had passed by it several times, stopping to stare at it from a distance as a teen. He imagined it had once been a place of great beauty and horrific tragedy before the Civil War. The roof was falling in some places, and the once bright white paint had fallen from the front pillars and was peeling away from the rest of the home. Trees, weeds, and vines were threatening to overtake the once great plantation home, now that the last surviving member of the generations of caretakers had succumbed to an unknown illness. But his passing was almost 10 years ago. With the pale moonlight, this house looked menacing, regardless of the spooky stories that made up the legends of Chatterwick. This was not a place Ben wanted to be. Yet, here he was, in this house, which seemed to surround his already fragile sanity from every angle, and the events that led Ben to this moment had happened so fast that he couldn't quite remember how he got there. Ben wasn't a coward by any means, a bit shy and introverted, but he had a great sense for danger and knew well how to avoid it. He stood in the foyer of the mansion with the two men who once bullied him in school. Years had gone by since then, and now Ben stood there looking around and sensing the sadness, pain, and fear seeping from the peeling walls and ceiling. He wondered why he was even reconciling in this way with these two half-wits. Although he was cautious about the house and his present company, he was now curious, once he was inside, not only about the ghosts that were rumored to frequent the halls of the mansion, but about the true intentions of his new friends. Though Ben had cold chills just standing in the entryway, he wanted to press on, to see exactly what the brothers Scott and Darrell had in store for him. In school, this would have never been something he would have even agreed to, but after losing his parents a year prior, he had become bolder. They were his only relatives, and he had nothing left to lose. Darrell looked at his brother, who was 1 year younger than Darrell. "What do you think, Scott?" Scott surveyed the area, walked over to an old entry table, and kicked it over. "Yeah, this is perfect." The Branson boys had come from less than a privileged life. Their father worked at the mill scraping pennies to make ends meet, the same mill their grandfather had worked, and now the brothers carried on that legacy, still scraping pennies to make ends meet. Ben eyed the two curiously. "If you're just going to tear the place up, I'm going to leave." The brothers glanced at each other and chuckled, and Scott spoke up. "Look, Darrell, he's afraid." Darrell slapped the back of his brother's head. "Shut up, stupid. So are you." Darrell turned to Ben. "We aren't here to tear the place apart. Just wanted to explore a bit as a kind of a way to say we're sorry for how we treated you in the past. I mean, what better way to make amends than chasing ghosts around?" The logic sounded less than satisfying to Ben, but all the same, he'd like to see those two scared out of their skins. Ben suspected it was all a lie. In fact, he was banking on it. He wasn't the type to seek confrontation. No, he shied away from it whenever possible. More than curiosity of this old mansion, Ben was curious as to what these brothers were up to, though. But the further he ventured into the house, the more he lost touch with his senses regarding those still present in the living world, and the more he didn't care. It was like the plantation had grabbed him and pulled him in, drawing curtains around his senses of awareness. The brothers didn't seem to have any issue. None on the surface, at least. If they did, they didn't show it. But these were men who had always tried to outdo each other with their bravery. Once in a while, Scott would kick an old piece of furniture or break something. Daryl would scold him, but Scott would just ignore it and move on to the next fragile item. Moving around the house from one room to another, Ben noticed it seemed to have a lot of the original decorations still inside. Old beds with dirty and rotting sheets with water stains on them, portraits hanging with discernible figures with faded paint and dark patches threatening to envelop the once elaborate art, and elegant diningware that had been rusted with pits digging through each piece left on the dining room table. The floors were in just as bad a condition as the rest of the house. The floorboards were damp where water had leaked into the home and made them feel slightly spongy under his feet, to the point that there was a couple moments when Ben thought the floor would give way beneath him. As Ben rounded the corner from the dining area and peeked back into the foyer, he noticed the table that Daryl had kicked over was standing on all four legs again, back in the same spot it had stood before the intruders arrived. He didn't give it much thought, but kept a mental note in the back of his mind. He thought maybe Scott had picked it up, but that would be respectful. A quick thought that these guys weren't the type to pick up after themselves came and went. Then something caught the corner of his eye, moving from the stairs. The house was dark, but this motion was even darker, so he couldn't be sure. But when he turned his head, there was nothing there. Ben smirked a little at his own imagination getting carried away. The floorboards began creaking up the stairs as Ben turned away from them, and he snapped around to see there was nothing there again. That was enough for Ben. He turned toward the stairs and slowly began ascending. He could hear the brothers moving toward his location, as he was sure they heard him squeaking the stairs with his own footsteps. As he climbed the long, curved stairway, he realized he wasn't afraid, not even a little. He felt eager to see something. This had been an hour's ride from his home, and he didn't want it to go to waste. He just wished he had brought a light of some kind. His senses began to sharpen as he heard the footsteps enter the hallway above and a door slam shut. Just then, from the bottom of the stairs, he heard the brothers chuckle, then their own footsteps as they began to follow him up. With his back to them and never looking back at them, Ben rolled his eyes and took a deep breath. The thoughts came back to the forefront of his mind. Is this where they would try to trap him? So he kept his hearing sharp. But their footsteps weren't getting any closer, just keeping pace with his, like they were actually afraid and wanted Ben to run into danger first. When Ben reached the top of the stairs, he could see glints of details in the hallway ahead of him, illuminated by the moon shining through cracks in the doors, lining the once great wing of the mansion. Otherwise, the hall looked like a tunnel leading into the distance. Suddenly, a door opened, and the bluish moonlight poured into the hall. He couldn't see what had opened the door. Only the shadow of a tall man stretched on the opposite door. Ben stopped just before the hallway and just watched. He heard the footsteps behind him ease their way back down the stairs, but when he looked back, the large stairway was empty. A crash came from downstairs and the hallway door slammed shut. He heard the words come out of his mouth before he could stop them. These idiots. But with the brothers back downstairs, Ben was free to walk the hall, untethered by any annoyances of those who had accompanied him. So he had moved to the hallway, keeping his ears open as he heard the brothers causing chaos downstairs. As Ben entered the dark hallway, he heard footsteps running up the stairs behind him, stomping so hard it sounded like the boards would collapse. He looked back and saw the brothers rushing up. Then they stopped just short of the top, watching as Ben disappeared into the darkness of the hallway, not saying a word, motionless. Everything seemed odd. If this was some elaborate prank, they weren't very good at it. If it was a way to get Ben alone to cause him harm, they weren't behaving in line with some of those grand schemes. Ben stood still as he heard the old brass knob turn on the door that had opened just moments earlier. The door squeaked open again, sounding as if it was going to break from the hinges. Moonlight once again bathed the opposite door in a baby blue light, and the shadow appeared once more, stretching from the floor just inside the door and onto the adjacent door. He was close enough now that he could hear the floorboards bend and bow under the weight of the figure who had just moved out of sight. He looked back, and the brothers were motionless on the second to last step, looking unafraid. But Ben knew differently. Choosing his steps wisely and not putting his full weight on the floor, Ben stepped slowly toward the open door. It slammed shut again, along with the rest of the doors lining the hallway that had opened, and the hallway went pitch black. Ben looked back as he became bathed in the darkness. The boys were now at the top of the steps, grinning. If they were afraid, they were really good at hiding it. Then a gust of cold air shot from the opposite end of the hall and excited every hair follicle on Ben's arms and neck. He turned, and the boys were now nearer to the entrance of the hall. He hadn't heard them move in his distractions. He spoke softly to them. "Did you guys feel that?" They stared at Ben and shook their heads slowly while grimacing at him. How could they not feel it? The ice cold, the gust of rushing air, none of it? They had to be lying. Ben approached the door that had opened just before. He wrapped his fingers around the doorknob and turned it slowly. It didn't budge easily. He had to put his shoulder into it, but it seemed locked from the other side. Finally, the hinges screamed and the door opened just enough for Ben to peek in. Blue light blanketed the room, and he could see the moon outside the glassless window, a dirty bed on the opposite side of the room. The entire room was illuminated with the blue hue, all but one corner. Ben looked back, and the brothers were now closer to him, unmoving. They looked as though they were frozen in time, smiling eerily. This must be where they were going to spring their stupid trap. How predictable. He peered into the room a moment longer, and from the shadowed corner he saw a darker figure sitting with its knees pulled up to its chest and arms around them. Ben let out a gasp and pulled the door closed with all his strength. Another door behind Ben to his right opened slowly. A shadow cast against the wall right next to him, pacing side to side. He turned and the door slammed shut. Then another door down the hall further away did the same thing. The hairs on Ben's neck became excited and stood straight up, pulling his skin tight. The smell emitting from each room as it opened was unlike anything Ben had ever witnessed. Decay. The doors started opening faster and slamming shut. He looked back and the brothers were gone. This couldn't be a prank. They weren't intelligent enough to pull off something like this. As each door opened, another shadow would appear and disappear behind the door as it closed. Then the voices started. "What are you doing here?" whispered in a low hum, muffled somehow. Ben's nerves began to give way, and he wished he had retreated with the brothers. Ben began walking back down the hall from the way he came. He didn't remember walking this far in. Another door opened. Another shadow appeared. Another voice, a little clearer than the last. "What are you doing here?" He started walking faster back down the hall, but it seemed like the faster he moved, the slower he would go. He turned as another door creaked open. It was the door at the very end of the dark hallway. All other doors had closed at this point, and the only light in the hallway was that of the newly opened door. A white light, brighter than any bulb or lantern he had ever seen. A dark figure stood in front of the door, unmoving, still, silent. The door stayed open. Ben could feel hands grab under his arms as his legs gave way. He was being dragged toward the door. His eyesight became blurry. His feet felt numb. Closer and closer to the doors, the voices became louder. "What are you doing here?" He looked to his left and right and saw only white blurs holding him up, human-like figures dragging him. His eyelids began to slam shut as he tried to hold them open. Using every ounce of his strength, Ben tried prying his eyes open with sheer willpower. There was no use, and his eyes locked shut. He could see the bright light of the room approaching through the capillaries in his eyelids. He felt his entire body go limp, his thin frame suspended by the ghostly figures. Then, darkness. Ben awoke the next morning in bed. The light of his room had not been turned off. Next to him sat an older man with graying beard, clean-shaven, curiously looking at Ben. Folded under his hands in his lap was a notebook. "Good morning, Ben. Would you like to talk about last night?" Ben looked around confused. The white walls were bare. The light was brighter than he remembered in his room. His voice shaking. "What? Where am I? What happened? Where are Scott and Daryl?" The man pushed his eyebrows into a peak between his eyes. "Tell me about last night." Ben tried to move his arms, but nothing happened. Someone was restraining him. No, not someone. Something. He looked at his arms splayed out in his bed to see straps around his wrists tethered to the bed. "Ben, I'm talking to you." Ben looked at the man, his voice still shaking and a little hoarse. "What's happening to me? Where am I? And where are Scott and Daryl?" The man sighed and wrote something into his notebook. He folded the notebook closed and took a deep breath. "Ben, we've been over this. You're in Chatterwick Asylum for the mentally insane. You were brought here 2 years ago after you killed Scott and Daryl Branson." Ben tried worming his way free of the restraints. "No, that's impossible. I was just with them last night." Dr. Burkhart gave Ben a concerning look. "No, you were hallucinating from the Thorazine wearing off. We still don't know how you got out of your room, but we've had this talk many times, and you don't seem to be getting any better. You're a danger to the other patients and yourself. I don't have any choice." Dr. Burkhart stood and walked to the metal door as Ben screamed in the background. He tapped on it, and it squealed open. On the other side was a nurse and a larger man dressed all in white. "Nurse, schedule the lobotomy for this afternoon." Ben heard this and started thrashing wildly within his wrist and ankle restraints, screaming, pleading, begging. The beggar man walked into the room and stood next to Ben. Ben looked over just in time to see the needle enter his skin. Then, blackness. If you've enjoyed this story, go check out some of my other stories. And please don't forget to hit the subscribe button and like the video and leave a comment down below and let me know what you thought. Until the next time, this is Gerald with Twilight of Horror, telling you all, stay weird.